We're about 24 hours away from a major announcement about the nominee President Trump will select to fill the seat vacated by the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at the Federalist. I'm here with my colleague Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at the Federalist. We're going to break down what you can expect from tomorrow's announcement at the White House by President Trump. That's at 5 p.m. on Saturday, and there's a lot to talk about. Kylee, one question that I think might be on everybody's mind, it looks like it's going to be Amy Coney Barrett, right? It looks like Donald Trump is going to select Amy Coney Barrett, but is there any chance there's another nominee?
It's Donald Trump. There's a chance for anything.
Right.
I mean, who knows, right? He could make the decision tomorrow morning and decide that he wants to backtrack and select somebody else. So I don't think anything is off the table. But if I were betting on this, I would put all my money on Amy Coney Barrett as the nominee.
Disclaimer, do not take Kylie's gambling advice. But yes, I mean, I think all of the signs are pointing towards Amy Coney Barrett, and I think probably one of the biggest advantages she has as a potential nominee is that she has gone through a pretty rigorous vetting process already, and that she was close to the top of the list when Trump ultimately went with Brett Kavanaugh. And so she's had conversations with the people who are thinking about this decision, and they've had her on that list for a while now. So she's familiar to them. She's very familiar to them.
Right. So obviously it's an advantage to go with somebody that's already been pretty extensively vetted, but there are definitely drawbacks to ACB. Of course, the most obvious one is the religious litmus tests that are sure to be imposed if she is the nominee. So I think you have the advantage of she's already been vetted, but you also have the disadvantage of it might be a more difficult nomination process.
So, right, that's a double-edged sword, because obviously Donald Trump is running against Joe Biden, who a lot of people probably refer to as a Catholic in name only. And so selecting somebody like Amy Coney Barrett and then having the left in the Democratic Party likely, and they, by the way, I'm sure establishment Democrats are trying to figure out a way to kind of restrain some of their further left members right off the bat already right now from stumbling into something that like Senator Dianne Feinstein did when she said the dogma lives loudly in you. So I'm sure establishment Democrats are freaked out about that possibility, but at the same time, I don't see any way that even establishment Democrats avoid the temptation to question her about her faith when it comes to social issues like abortion and LGBT rights.
Right. Well, so Joe Biden is still clinging to this, Catholic identity. So it'll be interesting to see the Democrats try to, support the nominee, the presidential nominee, but then also try to make that a strike against Amy Coney Barrett, assuming she's the nominee. It'll also be interesting because on the Senate Judiciary Committee is the vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris. So she was one of the toughest, just most awful people during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. And it'll be interesting to see how she approaches Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, particularly if the Catholic element becomes a big deal because of Biden's Catholic faith.
Right, and a lot of Catholics already believe Kamala Harris has exhibited a staunch anti-Catholic bias. And you know what, I think it's important when we talk about this anti-Catholic bias, actually to speak about it more broadly as an anti-Christian bias, because when they're attacking ACB on her Catholic faith and on tenets of her Catholic faith, it's typically on tenets that are shared among a lot of evangelical Christians and Christians more broadly in this country. And the real bias at play here is just against people of faith who happen to believe, Christians who believe that their faith teaches things different on social issues than what Democrats have come to embrace. And look at somebody like Joe Biden, who embraced gay marriage before President Obama did.
Which is absurd for two reasons. I mean, it's absurd because everybody is guided by some worldview. And so, the left has their own tenets that they've really elevated to the level of being their own kind of pseudo-religion. But that's not okay for Christians to do. And also you have the element that, this is for the Supreme Court, which is upholding the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mean, in the First Amendment is freedom of religion. And so just the fact that this has become so polarized in Supreme Court nominations is ridiculous.
Right. And so we're having this conversation, obviously, as though this is going to be Amy Coney Barrett. And I think we're pretty comfortable that that's the case. Kylee is right to say that this could literally change at any moment. Kylee, why do you think the president is set on picking a woman to fill this seat? And do you think that helps the nominee or hurts her?
We talked about this earlier this week. There's several reasons to pick a woman here. Of course, she's replacing a woman on the court. So it seems to me that it's both a principled and political decision. It could help him, draw in female voters potentially in 2020.
Yeah.
And it just seems like the principled thing to do. I mean, the court, there's only 9 people on the court. A lot of cases that reach the Supreme Court have to do with issues that very directly will affect women's lives, be it about, contraception or healthcare or things like that. And so I think it's very important to choose a woman. And I think Donald Trump is really prudent in replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg with a female. I think it would be really bad optics, politically, to choose another male to fill that seat. And he's already, of course, nominated 2 other men during his term, which is completely fine, but I think it makes sense to nominate a woman here.
Well, and for the sake of argument, let's put the principle aside, because I agree with you completely on the principle, and I actually wish that a woman had been nominated when Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. Not to say that I opposed the Kavanaugh nomination, I certainly didn't, but I thought that would have made sense at the time, based on the reasons that Kylee just mentioned. But principle aside for the moment, and for the sake of argument, does this help Donald Trump in the suburbs? I actually think there's a case to be made that it will, because Amy Coney Barrett in this case is almost going to become a third or second running mate to Donald Trump. It's almost like she's a third person on the ticket here, because we know the Supreme Court is so important to conservative voters and so important to the left right now, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was their patron saint. And I say that kind of facetiously, but they literally had prayer candles of her made throughout her tenure on the court, and that were in front of the Supreme Court last week. And so I think when you have like a lot of this election, you have both parties fighting for educated suburban women, people who would typically vote Republican but might be so disgusted by Donald Trump, as the theory goes, that they're going to cast their ballots for Joe Biden. By the way, those might be people who aren't showing up well in polling because they don't want to say who their actual preference is. So it is hard to measure some of those attitudes. But if that theory is correct, does Amy Coney Barrett help? I think yes. What do you think?
I agree. And I think it's interesting that you characterize her basically as another running mate. This is a very concrete person that is basically on the ballot in 2020. And this tactic has worked really well for Trump in the past, by bringing along people who have this religious component. I mean, I would liken ACB to Mike Pence. It's like you have Donald Trump. He knows how to rally his base. He knows how to appeal to voters. But despite what Never Trumpers and the resistance will tell you, people do not view largely Donald Trump as a religious candidate. And yet so much of his base is made up of evangelical Christians, people who, want to see those morals put forward. And so, grabbing somebody like Mike Pence to be on a ticket with you, now, nominating someone like Amy Coney Barrett could really help him with his base.
Yeah, and Kylee writes about that a lot. And I wonder even sort of beyond the Trump base, because I actually think the Trump base is going to be just sort of like the resistance base. Like these people are voting,
right.
And they're voting for their candidate. There's no sort of like people on the fence in either side's base. It's really when we talk about the base at this point, it's about turnout. But in terms of some of those swing voters, suburban women, Amy Coney Barrett is a mother of many children, of 2 adopted children from Haiti. She's, I think, a pretty likable, seems like an average kind of mom next door type woman who also happens to be a brilliant jurist.
Right.
And so I think, if they, and we'll have to see how she sort of, how she performs when those harsh lights of a presidential campaign and a confirmation process and the entire media are, focused directly on her. That can obviously change some people's ability to have a likable persona and to, perform in public. But if she holds up, I think she's a very, she can soften Trump to some of those women. But that's what we have to do, is anticipate the left to sort of make that prediction. We have to anticipate how the left is going to treat Amy Coney Barrett.
Right.
What do you think the attacks would be? And again, we are assuming she's the nominee, but
right.
for the sake of argument, what do you think the left's attacks on her are going to be? It's a $1 million question that conservatives have been debating all week.
Well, I mean, I really think it comes down to her faith, but also, I mean, you just painted the profile of ACB. She's the kind of person that the left loves to hate. I mean, aside from
good person,
right? Aside from her Catholic faith, I mean, you know, she is a living proof that you don't have to sacrifice your career. You don't have to, you know, be a stay-at-home mom to be pro-family and to be pro-woman and, you know, to get things done. And so I think the attacks are going to focus on, you know, potentially her family life, or, you know, definitely it will come down to her faith. But I think it's really going to come down to the woman issue. I think they're going to try to smear her as anti-woman because she's a family woman. And it's just absurd to me that, you know, someone will try to paint another female as anti-woman.
Well, yeah, it's like...
But I think that's what they'll try.
Dr. Phyllis Schlafly, yeah.
yeah.
But, like... the question in my mind is the scale and the severity of these attacks. And so if you look at Amy Coney Barrett and you look at Brett Kavanaugh, I mean, Brett Kavanaugh apparently, you know, liked beer in college and still likes beer now, but there's two people seemingly straight-laced, family man, family woman, you know, with very little in their past. And yet the left actually was floating allegations that Brett Kavanaugh was in some sort of gang rape situation in college. And again, this is just like, what can they do? I think it actually defies the imagination, right? Like, I don't think we really know. And maybe Amy Coney Barrett is impossible to smear in the same way. Maybe that's because she's a woman. And in the Me Too era, there is almost nothing worse than sexual assault and rape that can be leveled at someone. And that's not just in the Me Too era, that's period. I wonder if it'll be about race.
You're saying you're wondering if something will surface from her past that they'll make it about, or?
I'm wondering if they're sort of digging through her past for a way to paint her as a racist, assuming that that's the most potent line of attack right now in September 2020.
Right. That's a really strong possibility. And I wouldn't put it past them, of course, to take something that's really an innocuous comment that's not racist at all and make it about race.
I mean, they do that every day.
Of course.
Yeah. But again, it's a question of like the severity, right? Like how, because with Kavanaugh, I mean, that was a rape allegation and an attempted rape allegation. And it didn't matter how murky the story was or the allegation was. It didn't matter how thin the sourcing was. This was a blockbuster. This dominated the media. And that was a narrative that was really impossible and difficult for Republicans to kind of chisel away at. And I think if you know, walked up to a lot of just like average voters, they still probably wouldn't know, you know, whether like how serious those are. Like the media coverage really legitimized it. And the Democratic approach to it really legitimized that allegation in a way that it didn't deserve to be legitimized. And so if it's Amy Coney Barrett, if it's Lagoa, whoever it is, they should be prepared. And I'm sure they are. Probably, I mean, to have their reputation. Like Brett Kavanaugh said he couldn't coach his daughter's basketball team after that. Right,
which is absurd.
Or he said something to the extent that like he was worried. I forget what the exact claim was, but they should be in for something that I think really defies our ability to predict.
I agree. So I think there is something to the racism thing. It is the moment to bring that up. I think that would be a really, they would think it would be an effective way to smear her. So assuming that, you know, the people trying to dig up dirt on ACB come up with a comment that's not actually racist, but that they can spin as racist. Do you think there's any way that actually helps the left's cause versus the right?
No, I do. I mean, I think it's in the way that would help the right is with turnout. And it would have like the base would, again, like the base is already pretty mobilized, but like you will just have every person who wanted to vote out if they do that to Amy Coney Barrett in the same way they did to Brett Kavanaugh. There won't be people who are sick and skipping
Right.
Well, hopefully not with coronavirus,
Right.
but
you're saying it would help the right, not the left.
no, I actually think it helps the left because the media is so powerful that they can take anything and set the narrative. So now that conservative media and people like Molly Hemingway and the Federalist exist to push back on this narrative, as we were doing in real time, and Molly was certainly doing in real time during the Kavanaugh allegation. So we're out there and we're providing the counterpoint all the time, but there's just no, like right now, as the state of the mainstream media, the corporate media is still way more powerful.
Right.
And so it's just like, once the corporate media latches onto a narrative, that's what a lot of, again, like sort of average voters who, still don't understand the level of corruption that exists at CNN and other, previously reputable news outlets.
So not CNN.
Right. Yeah. So, but again, like if they say someone is anti-woman and wants to shoot abortionists and imprison girls who get an abortion. It doesn't matter, again, like how thinly sourced this stuff is. Once it's out there, and it will affect some people's votes. And so the question is how many? But I think you are looking, especially with a woman like Amy Coney Barrett, at a subsection of sort of educated suburban women who this could impact in either direction. And I do think that the left has a lot of, like, in some ways, those women are going to be so disgusted if they try to tear down Amy Coney Barrett. And so some might break right, but then others might, not want another Trumpian, religious extremist, Handmaid's Tale perpetrator on the court.
But I think if you use the Kavanaugh situation kind of as a template for how this goes, if they do that, I think that if the 2020 election had been held immediately following the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation, Donald Trump would have won handily. And I think part of that has to do with, the left does control the mainstream media institutions, of course, but people clearly saw through the huge smear campaign, just the absolute ridiculousness of that entire thing. And so depending how ridiculous the Democrats and the media get, I think it's possible that even if they're just spreading lies constantly, that it could actually work to Trump and ACB's favor.
Well, one thing we also have to keep in mind is that the left has an ability to leverage the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, as we've seen over the course of the past week, was a pop culture figure that was widely revered. I saw on my social media feeds people that aren't really political posting remembrances of Ruth Bader Ginsburg just as, some sort of heroic female champion. And so the left can really leverage that. And the other thing is, if we're talking about how Amy Coney Barrett would impact the female vote or any other female nominee, women approach women differently. Differently than they would approach somebody like Brett Kavanaugh, and they're going to approach attacks on women differently than, and men will approach attacks on women differently than they did on Brett Kavanaugh. So again, I think some of this defies our ability to predict, but Donald Trump is going straight from the White House after his announcement to Pennsylvania. And as one of our colleagues said, you don't go to Pennsylvania after announcing a nominee from Florida, which would be Lagoa. So that may be another piece of evidence that this is going to be Amy Coney Barrett. But what do you expect from the president at tomorrow night's show in Pennsylvania?
Oh, I think it's going to be a rally like no other. If you've been to one of his rallies, you know that it is just quite a time. There's really nothing like it anyway. I think he's going to raise hell in that swing state, and hopefully for the better.
Yeah, he's also going to be talking a lot about mail-in ballots tomorrow, and so the media is going to be freaking out and claiming that he's continuing to delegitimize the election, which, by the way, they are also doing. So it's going to be, however, the way that he handles the Supreme Court nominee is going to set the tone for the way I think the campaign, it's a rollout, right? So this is going to be our preview of how Republicans pitch this woman to the country. And honestly, the way they pitch it to the country is how you're going to see some of these senators that Republicans need, that they're going to determine their response, based on the public's response. It's going to factor into their decision. And so, I don't think he's going to get Susan Collins maybe. I don't think he will get a vote from Susan Collins, but there are some other senators. I mean, what if he gets Joe Manchin?
What if?
I mean, I don't know. Like, it's Amy Coney Barrett was sort of jettisoned last time around because people thought she was too polarizing, and you would never pick off some Democratic votes, in the way that you might be able to get with Kavanaugh. And I actually think that's true. I mean, she's polarizing because she's, I guess, like very religious, although I think Kavanaugh was very religious too. Like, I don't know if it's just because she has a big family and sort of is like an obvious cultural Catholic. I mean, I don't really understand I don't know.
Well, and another reason she's polarizing, which you touched on briefly, is that, during the Kavanaugh thing, he was replacing a conservative, but like the swing voter on the court that was also a male. So, it was a conservative coming in for a conservative. And in this case, not only is it a conservative nominee filling a far left on the bench seat, but it's also someone replacing a celebrity. She's not just a justice. She's a media darling and a celebrity. And so that just makes things way more polarized than they would already be.
Yeah. And again, more evidence that I think it's going to be Amy Coney Barrett tomorrow, and Kylee thinks the same. It's been reported that she was sort of assured last time around when Trump went with Kavanaugh that they were saving her for the next nomination. And who would have thought that would literally happen less than 2 months away from Election Day? This news cycle, the state of our politics seems to be as wild as ever before. But we will be here to help you keep track of all of it. Please like and subscribe while you're here. I'm Emily Jashinsky. She's Kylee Zempel. Until next time.